So I am recording my homily for the 33rd week in Ordinary Time, 33rd Sunday. And it also happened to fall on the feast day of St. Francis Cabrini. And we are actually in St. Francis Cabrini Catholic Church in Lakewood, Washington. I was pastor here for 8 years, and I'm no longer here. But I was coming down this weekend for my Jesu Caritas group meeting with a group of priests. And so I was here in Lakewood, and I'm going to talk a little bit about St. Francis Cabrini, so I thought, what a perfect place to record my homily. Now, the readings for this week are rather dire. They're readings where we're starting to work our way into the very end of the liturgical year. And so next week is the Feast of Christ the King. And then the first 2 weeks of Advent, we also have readings that are all kind of focusing on the end times, the end of the world, however you want to put it, the fulfillment of everything Jesus comes to do. But the readings today, the Gospel today from Luke in chapter 21, and as well from Malachi, they're kind of depressing. And here's what I mean by that. Not necessarily just because it seems like it's about the end of the world, but in some ways it's about how it's said. So Jesus is going before the temple, and he's with his disciples. Now his disciples are impressed with the temple. You know, it'd be like us as Catholics going to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. You'd just be so excited to go there, right? Even if you've been there before. And so you imagine the disciples excited, and they're talking about the temple, how it was adorned with costly stones and votives, and they were very impressed by that. And also the temple was the center of Jewish life, and I would say it was the center of Jewish faith. And Jesus comes along and says that it's going to get torn down. Even for the disciples, this would have been, even though they were rebelling in some ways against the establishment, it still would have been something very difficult for them to hear. You know, even if somebody was really frustrated with how things were going in Rome, you still wouldn't necessarily want somebody to come along and say, well, the basilica is going to one day be destroyed. That would be kind of hard to take. Now, here's the thing. Jesus doesn't just talk about the temple being destroyed. Now, we know 40 years after this moment, the temple is going to be destroyed by the Romans, right? And it will never be rebuilt, ever. If you go to Jerusalem today, all you have is the Wailing Wall. That's all that's left. And they call it the Wailing Wall because they are still wailing, they're still grieving the loss of their temple. But you know we're going down this path. We have to go deeper, because with Jesus, there's always something deeper at work. Okay? Now, if that wasn't depressing enough that the temple is going to be destroyed, he begins to tell the disciples that they're going to get led before the governors, before the Pharisees, before all these leaders, and they're going to be tortured, imprisoned, and even killed. Right? And even before that, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Before that, Jesus talks about wars and insurrections and earthquakes and all these horrible things. And you're saying, okay, that's bad. And then after that, see, I did things backwards, sorry. After that, then he starts talking about how we are going to be put on trial and imprisoned. And even our own family members are going to hand us over. That is all very depressing, and it's all very dire. So, we have to go deeper, right? What is Jesus trying to communicate to us? Because if he's just trying to scare us, that doesn't make any sense. Jesus did not go around trying to instill fear in people. Fear accomplishes nothing in the gospel. It's love, right? And so this doesn't seem to make sense. So, again, why is Jesus doing this? Now, I have to be honest with you. When I was reading this gospel, I felt like my life made no difference. Like my life was just a tiny grain of sand, and this huge destructive wave is going to come over the earth and destroy everything, and I'm going to be nothing more than a little speck of dust in that. Now, that doesn't make sense with Jesus. He didn't come to make us feel small. He came to make us feel like we are His children, children of God. Okay, so let's go deeper. Now, Malachi, in the first reading today, he's kind of doing the same thing. Now, Malachi is a prophet, and the prophets who prophesied doom and gloom were often prophesying doom and gloom because the people were not faithful. It wasn't necessarily because the economy was bad. It wasn't because there were bad things happening in the world. It's because they were not faithful. And so that was the key. It's our sinfulness brings upon us bad things, right? Okay. Now, when I was reading Malachi, there was just a few minutes when I was sitting just in front of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, and I was praying about the readings. And I remember I've only really known one person who was named Malachi. And so Malachi was a 15-year-old teenage boy who was part of our parish, actually when I was here at Cabrini, and his family for a few years was attending here at Cabrini. And so Malachi was a 15-year-old boy, and he came up to me and he asked me if I could do spiritual direction with him. And that's not necessarily common for a 15-year-old boy to ask for that. Usually if they're coming to talk to the priest, it's because their parents are dragging them, pinching them by the ear because they did something bad. And so that wasn't the case for Malachi. Now Malachi comes and asks for spiritual direction, and he begins to tell me that he's hoping one day to be a priest. It's pretty impressive, right? And as I got to know Malachi and I did a little bit of spiritual direction with him, I noticed he was a very deep person, far beyond his years. And there's a reason for that. So Malachi has a disease called cystic fibrosis, and it's genetic, and several of his siblings also has cystic fibrosis. And cystic fibrosis is a horrible disease to have. A typical life expectancy of somebody with it is about 25 years. So he knew, especially since he had it very bad. Now Malachi would typically not be able to attend school in a public school because every year he was ending up in the hospital, and so he spent many months of his life, if not years of his life, in the hospital. And so he would have to do homeschooling, which meant he was isolated. He didn't have a big circle of friends that he could just hang out with and be a normal kid. Every year it was life and death for him. And every year was life and death for his parents, because he had to confront it, and for his brothers and sisters. And so he took on a persona in his family, a persona in his community that was far deeper. Now, the other thing with cystic fibrosis is that typically with men who have it, boys, that they're sterile, which means they can never have children. And so you take somebody who has this disease, they can never have a family, they're going to die young. I mean, that's the odds. They're going to die young. It's almost like you're reading the gospel, but in light of their life. It's like just their life is written, and there's no escaping it, and it's going to be very short, and it's going to be rather painful. Kind of dire, right? But I have to tell you, Malachi, with all his struggles, he desired to go so deep with God. He wanted to go as deep as he possibly could. And he truly wanted to be able to serve God. He wanted to be able to be someone who God would say he lived life to the fullest. He lived his faith to the fullest. I think Malachi knew, or he knows, there's a pretty high probability he would never be a priest just because of his health. And so when I was doing spiritual direction with him, I tried to help him see that maybe he was going to be a different kind of priest. Not a ministerial priest, not one that would be up here, but one that was going to plant the cross right in the middle of his family. And that by his own self-gift, by becoming just like Jesus as best as he could, and by God's grace, he could, in his own way, plant that cross right in the middle of his family and allow Jesus Christ to be there. Now that's inspiring. That makes it seem like all the direness is not really dire at all. And yet it seems like it's full of hope. It feels like even though you have all these things laid out for us and we're not really in control, that we have the ability to be part of the central act of Jesus Christ as he plants himself right in the middle where he belongs. Two years ago, we took our youth group from St. Francis Cabrini and St. John Bosco parishes, and so we took about 20 kids to New York City for a mission trip. So we did a little evangelization. We helped out with the missionaries of charity. We went and visited the Dominicans and the Franciscan Friars of the Renewal, and it was a great time in New York. One day, we went down to Times Square. Now, if you've never been to Times Square is it's almost like a church to the culture. And so you're walking down the middle of the street there, and you're in Times Square, and every building is covered with these gigantic TV screens, and they're flashing bright images of advertisements, and there's music blaring, and there's the smell of food everywhere. It's like anybody who wants to be entertained and have all their senses just engaged, that's it. Everything is just screaming for your attention. It's like a church built to the world, to how the world thinks. It's commercialism at its best. And so we take the kids down into Times Square, and the kids are just blown away by it because you cannot help. It's just so overwhelming. And some of the things going on in Times Square are not exactly moral in a positive way. And so I was like, oh man, the parents are going to kill me for bringing them here. But as I'm walking down Times Square, down the street, I noticed I could see just a little bit off in the distance, maybe 50, maybe 100 yards down, this big cross in the middle of the street. And I look at it, and I kind of look around because it just doesn't fit at all. You know, have you been in a moment like that where you saw something that just did not fit at all? And so I started walking towards it, and the cross was just getting bigger and bigger. And it turns out it's about 15 feet tall. And it's a giant granite cross right in the middle of the street, in the middle of Times Square. So I was absolutely fascinated because it's like everybody was just kind of ignoring it. It's just there, with all the other things, all the other diversions and distractions going on. So I walk around the backside, or I guess would be the front of it, and it's a monument dedicated to a Catholic priest. A Catholic priest who served in the military in World War I and several other wars. And his life was just so inspiring that the people there dedicated this monument to him and put it right in the middle of Times Square. And I just stood there for a good half hour, 45 minutes, just taking it in and just looking at the cross, and I couldn't help but just start praying. Because I began to think, this is exactly how Jesus works. That in the midst of everything going on in our lives, in the midst of all the good and the bad, especially when we have all kinds of bad things going on and we become consumed with our anxieties or we become consumed with distractions, Jesus Christ is there. And his cross is planted, and it's not going anywhere. No matter what we do, we just circle around it or we just ignore it, but it's there, right in the center. And it's quiet, it's peaceful, it's patient, it's a gentle presence, But one day in Times Square, all those TV screens, they're going to get turned off. And all the distractions, all the businesses that are advertising, the theater and the movies and the music, they'll come and go. But the cross won't. And I don't mean the granite cross, but I mean Jesus Christ. And so when Jesus Christ goes to the temple and he's saying, that temple is going to be torn down, what he's really saying is, this is the end, but it's not really the end. This is the beginning. Right? I think this is why we have these readings right before Advent, because he's bringing us to the end in order to bring us to the beginning. That the beginning is now with him. And very shortly after he's seeing the temple and giving this prophecy to his disciples, his cross is going to be planted only a couple blocks away on Golgotha. Right? And that cross is going to be planted forever in the earth. And our faith is never going anywhere. It's here forever until the end. And so there is the message, I believe, of this gospel. It's not about being afraid of the end times. It's not about being afraid of the end of the world. But it's about being able to say, as a disciple of Jesus Christ, I will be faithful to the end. I'm going to pour myself out to the end. I'm going to do what Jesus did. I'm going to live the gospel to the end. I think that's what Malachi was trying to do in his life. To be faithful to the end. St. Frances Cabrini, as we all know, lived and worked in the United States for most of her life. I want to talk a little bit about her. So she began a religious order that was missionary. And when she was younger, she was studying to become a teacher. And she wanted to be a teacher. And as she was preparing to start her career in teaching, both of her parents and one of her sisters died all in the same year. And it devastated her. It devastated the family. And so she returned home to help take care of the family. And she was watching her plans just slip away and dissolve. And to somebody who doesn't have faith, that would be devastating. It would be like, God, what are you doing, right? But God was working, and I think she knew that. Well, I know she knew that, right? God was working. She eventually began to discern entering a convent and to becoming a sister. And so she had a good relationship with the bishop, and so she enters a convent. And so the convent that she enters was quite dysfunctional. The two sisters who were basically in charge, the Mother Superior and another sister, were pretty severe alcoholics, and they made life absolutely hellish for everybody. It was a very dysfunctional family. And there were several times that she went to the bishop, Mother Cabrini. She wasn't Mother Cabrini at the time yet, but Sister Cabrini. She went to the bishop and she said, I am done. It's like she turns in her papers and says, I'm done. I can't take this. This is crazy. It's a dysfunctional family. I can't handle this. And so, you know what the bishop would say? Be patient. God's at work. Be patient. Well, not too long later, the bishop makes Sister Cabrini Mother Cabrini and puts her in charge and begins to change what this community had been. And these sisters did not like that, obviously. But hence, by perseverance, by being faithful to the end, her life was open to being able to be that cross planted there. Now, she would eventually go to found this order that would become missionary sisters. And the very first thing that she wanted to do was something that she always wanted to do, and that was to be a missionary in China. And so she goes to the bishop and says, Bishop, let's go to China. And he says, no, I want you to go to the United States. Now, up to this point, basically nothing has gone according to her plans. But they've gone according to God's plans. And so she was faithful. She was obedient. She was patient. and she let God work. Now, she did work actually in our diocese. She's the only saint, canonized saint, who has worked in the Archdiocese of Seattle. She established Cabrini Towers and the orphanage. She established an orphanage in Seattle, which is now still a school, but it's independently run. So she established these things in Seattle, but she spent most of her time in Chicago. Now, in Chicago, there's a joke, and I heard it by someone when I was in the seminary, and I don't know if it's true or not, but anyways, there's a joke about the bishop in Chicago. He had two desires. One, that he could claim a canonized saint for his diocese. Okay? He got his wish. Mother Cabrini, St. Francis Cabrini. And his second wish was that he could get rid of Mother Cabrini. Now, why? Because she was intense. She was feisty. She would push hard for the gospel. She was faithful to the end. You know, she didn't come all the way from Italy just to, sit on the beach. She wanted to work. And if anybody wasn't giving 100%, she didn't hesitate to call him on it. Hence, the bishop got frustrated with her, because saints do that. They push us to become better, right? To be faithful to the end. Now, one day, Mother Cabrini was reading the newspaper. My spiritual director was telling me, he says, a good Catholic will always have the newspaper in one hand and a Bible in the other. Because as Catholics, we take our faith and we apply it to the world. I thought that was great. So Mother Cabrini was reading the newspaper, and there was a story in the newspaper about some Italian immigrants. And so obviously that would have gotten her attention. She was an Italian immigrant. And what happened was, down in Louisiana, there was some Italian immigrants. There was a group of men who were Italians down there who were charged for a crime. And I don't remember what the crime was. I think it was murder, something like that. It was a serious crime. So they were charged with a crime, and it went to court, and they were proven innocent. Now, the people didn't like that, because the people thought they were guilty. And so after the court decided they were innocent, they went back out, they were freed, and the people went and lynched them, just killed them. So Mother Cabrini is reading this article. Now, for any one of us, we would be like, it's sad, but, who knows? Were they guilty? Were they innocent? Who knows? But Mother Cabrini reacted differently. You see, she was faithful to the end. And so she read it, she called in her sisters, and she said, "Sisters, I need to send 5 of you down to Louisiana." And the sisters were probably at first like, "What are you talking about?" And she said, this was all she said. She said, "They need Jesus. They need Jesus." I mean, she couldn't have said it any better than that. They need the cross to be planted in their community. They need to see Jesus. Whether the immigrants were innocent, guilty, whether the people were right or wrong, didn't make any difference. They needed Jesus. In our own lives, in the lives of the people around us, we all need that. We all need Jesus. And so if there's any meaning in this gospel that I think Jesus Christ wants us to hear very clearly, it's not to be afraid, but it's what the last line in the gospel says today. He says, persevere to the end. Don't be afraid. Don't worry about what you're going to have to say, whether or not you're going to say it right or wrong. Be faithful to the end. All right. Next week, I'm on vacation, and I can't guarantee I'm going to have a homily, but I will do my best. So I'll be traveling, so if I do record a homily, it'll probably be somewhere in the western area of the United States. I'm going to travel and visit a few people. So, God bless.